legal system was already beginning to react in the late 1960s. What was happening? You may know this, that there were various Africanization programs going on, particularly in Kenya. It started off, and then it spilled over into Uganda and Tanzania as well. And that was in the aftermath of the transition to independence in those countries. And what happened, of course, was that the Asians were marked out as the other, if you like, the other, and sometimes they were regarded as non-citizens or disloyal people and so on. The whole situation regarding passports and citizenship was deeply connected to the way in which the Asian presence in East African countries was framed. At the same time in Britain, of course, the politics of immigration was already highly racialized, right? So there was already immigration control in the early 1960s, which was enacted vis-a-vis Commonwealth migrants generally, broadly, right? And the targets were mainly those people coming from the Caribbean, but particularly those coming from South Asia. Now, in the late 1960s, when there was a movement of students basically in response to the Africanization program in Kenya, Asian students and others, like basically mainly male migrants, were using the UK as a kind of staging post, right? They were trying their luck in the UK because there was already pressure on some families in Kenya in terms of business, being able to do business freely and so on. And so as that movement became significant by 1967, the British Parliament moved to pass the Second Commonwealth Immigrants Act, right? And that was directly in response to the Asian immigration from Kenya. Right, so you can see a definite link between a particular population group and a migratory stream and reactive legislation. That legislation basically, what it did was to cut off a free right of immigration of those Asians who had held British passports and continued to enjoy free entry to the United Kingdom until 1968. After 1968, they no longer enjoyed that, and that had a sideways impact later on Ugandan Asians as well. What the British government did was that in the transition to independence, they agreed that various people who may be left out of the citizenship legislation of the newly independent East African countries could continue to retain a form of British status, and normally that British status would be the status that they already had prior to independence. Now, British nationality was already getting quite complicated at that time. So you had some people who were known as citizens of the United Kingdom colonies, others were British protected persons. There was a mixture of statuses, and their rights to immigration in the United Kingdom were somewhat ambiguous. Or the differences between their rights to immigration in the United Kingdom were already somewhat ambiguous since the 1962 Act. Actually, we can say with fair amount of certainty that under the 62 legislation, if you had a British protected person passport, which is what most people in Uganda would have had, some people in Kenya, but most people in Uganda would have had, you were already subject to immigration control. But we know from the evidence, from the factual evidence, that the British government continued to leave the door open even for those people after 1962. So that's why the 1968 Act comes in as a major marker, because that Act said that whether you're a citizen of the UK and colonies or you're a British protected person, you don't any longer have a right of free entry in the UK, right? You basically come under immigration control as everybody else does, right? Now, that's as far as domestic immigration law is concerned. But internationally, if you held a British passport, other countries would say, well, you're the responsibility of the British government, right? The British government has responsibility over you. We don't have the obligation to admit you because your formal citizenship status or nationality status is something else, right? So that's when the expulsion in Uganda happened. That's what put the British government in a corner, right? And in a way made the British government obliged to accept a certain number of British passport holders, because other countries began, the Ethiopians on one side, the other East African countries on the other side, even the Indians, right, began to say that, well, internationally these people are your responsibility because they hold your documents, right, or at least formally they have your citizenship status, and so you're obliged to accept them. In response, what the British did was to convene a United Nations meeting, right, to try to get other countries to agree to take at least some of the people who were being expelled from Uganda. And in fact, like many people went, as we know, went to Canada. Many people also went to India, actually, although the formal Indian government position was that these people are the responsibility of Britain. In fact, the door was left open, right? So because people had family connections or just historical connections to India, many actually chose to go there. And some of if you go to India today, you'll still find some old people who will pull out their British protected person passport from their drawer, you know, and people who have no intention of ever coming to Britain, but they have that as a kind of relic from their Uganda days. Yeah. So you get all kinds of people, you know. But the British government did manage to get some agreement from these countries that they will either leave the door open or actually accept some of these fleeing people from Uganda as refugees. And I think, in fact, the Canadian government in particular is quite notable for having taken, you know, but various European countries also agreed to take, you know, 500 there, 100 there, and so on. So you'll actually find the experience of the Ugandan Asians at that point was they became a kind of global diaspora overnight, right? Because they had to flee to whatever country would accept them. But many people, of course, did end up coming to Britain as well. That remains a fact, right? Because Britain ultimately couldn't deny responsibility for its nominally its nationals.